and welcome to Different Leaf, a show for new and experienced cannabis consumers. I'm Brit Smith. This episode, we're talking to members of 3 heirloom American families who have left their family's usual lines of business and have moved into legal marijuana. Today, we'll be talking to the grandkids of World War II U.S. Army General George S. Patton, French underwater explorer and marine conservation pioneer Jacques Cousteau, and the 32nd President of the United States, Franklin D. Roosevelt. We may have learned about these important figures in history class as kids, but since their grandchildren have now bucked tradition and entered the cannabis industry, it looks like the legacies of these 3 families are still being written. We'll be back with more from the 3 heirloom families after this quick break. First, I wanted to know why the Patton, Cousteau, and Roosevelt families got into cannabis. Turns out, a few years ago, General George S. Patton's descendants decided to involve their family's legacy in growing and selling marijuana, with a mission to provide quality cannabis and other forms of support to veterans around Massachusetts. So first, I asked why Bob Patton decided to attach his family name to cannabis by opening Green Meadows.
Well, I'll take you through the story. My grandfather, the famous World War II General George Patton, bought farmland in 1928 that was just in the family. No one really lived there much because we always moved around with Army postings. My father himself, a Major General, 2-star, retired in 1980 from the military after 34 years, and of all things, took what had been sort of an estate and said, I'm going to make a farm of it. And he did on a country road up north of Boston and made a Green Meadows farm with local employees. It became a community-supported agriculture collective. And the thing that was quite interesting with my father was that, this was a conservative military veteran, 3 tours in Vietnam, a tour in Korea. I mean, the real deal. And yet, to whatever extent generalities may apply or not apply, he sort of flipped the script and said, I want to become involved in sustainable agriculture, in green approaches to farming, cultivation. And that became the theme of Green Meadows Farm as he ran it, as well as having a good charitable footprint to always be able to a destination for veterans groups, for schools, for any kind of, sort of nonprofit that might want to have a gathering. And it was really quite an active and lovely place. He passed away from Parkinson's in 2004. My mother carried it on until 2017. And at that time, she was then in her mid-80s, came to me as the sibling that seemed to be one of 5 that would be the one that would carry it forward in some new iteration. And we sat down and we said, what will we do? And I'm not born and raised a farmer. That wasn't going to be the mission. But my younger brother and younger sister are involved with veteran charities. They each have foundations of their own. And they said, what about medical cannabis and veterans? And my first thought, and God bless her, my elderly mother's first thought was, we're just not going to do that. Not for any personal reason on my part. I've been certainly in favor of legalization and correcting some of the obviously major disparities in the drug wars where some communities suffered more than others in the crackdowns. And so we were all for it in that regard, but as a business enterprise, it seemed like a long shot. But God help us, we dove in when my mother with me sat down and we looked at the possibilities. And as I say, her first words were, over my dead body. That's a quote. And a few months later, she was actually making a presentation to a public forum in Topsfield, Massachusetts. And the last words of her little talk were, we must not be afraid of the new. And so really that guided us forward. And as it turned out, we did not do the cultivation of cannabis in the town where the farm had been. They weren't ready for it. It was kind of a suburban white collar town north of Boston, and they just weren't ready for cannabis yet. So we ended up moving, casting about for a new municipality, and we landed in Southbridge, Massachusetts. Completely different world for us, but a wonderful, wonderful finding, I think, for both them and us. A blue-collar city, well over 40% Latino, had lost a major industrial base. American Optical was there for decades, employing many thousands of people locally. They eventually dried up and went away. And this was a classic example of a former manufacturing hub floundering a bit, looking for investments, looking for vitalization. And while we are hardly a company to change the course of that, I think a lot is now happening in Southbridge. Veterans affairs, charity groups, new businesses, the public schools are picking up their game a little bit, and we're part of that, I think. I like to think that we're riding that crest and maybe had a little bit to do with starting it. In Southbridge, we have about a 4,000 square foot dispensary in an old converted mill building, 18-foot ceilings, brick walls. Through COVID, it's been terrific because it's a very voluminous space and people like that. So that's our first dispensary. We also there have a 30,000 square foot right next door in the same building cultivation and product manufacturing facility, all organic. And so we are purveying our own products as well as popular products from other producers and then wholesaling around the state. And as you say, Britt, we are opening soon. We're constructing it as we speak in Fitchburg, a new dispensary there for under the Green Meadows banner.
Next, the descendants of early 20th century ocean explorer and the inventor of scuba diving, Jacques Cousteau. His grandson Phillippe and Philippe's wife Ashlyn, former host of E! News, the Discovery Channel, and the Travel Channel, have launched a cannabis-infused skincare line cleverly named Seaweed Naturals, which comes in sustainable packaging and includes powerful plant ingredients from the sea and land, like kelp, seaweed, algae, and cannabinoids. So how did the Cousteaus float the idea of getting involved in weed?
Obviously, as the grandson of the explorer Jacques Cousteau, with that sort of family name, of course you're going to get into some sort of product that's inspired by the ocean, climate change, the benefits of sea plants. But what is it that moved you towards first starting to want to do skincare and secondly to include cannabis?
It is very much a reverse engineered kind of approach that we've taken. We talk a lot about intentionality, and it's definitely unusual, I think, for people when they hear that a Cousteau is in cannabis. People will ask, what's the connection between conservation in the ocean and cannabis? And it's a really good question, but we started with the intentionality of wanting to create a brand that would help support ocean restoration and good sustainable jobs and, ultimately continue the legacy of building a better world. It was really Ashlyn that over the past few years has really impressed upon me the importance with her background in pop culture, this idea of taking risk and being a little bit less earnest and being fun. So a couple of years ago, it was her idea was the name. We were joking with a friend, our co-founder, Joe Belasco, who's been in the cannabis industry for several years and is a long, dear friend of ours, was saying, y'all should think about the cannabis space. I know you want to create a brand and a lifestyle brand and a wellness brand and look at cannabis. And we're like, cannabis, you crazy? Like, I'm a nonprofit that does youth education. And we're, this family that's been around for generations now that's well respected around the world and et cetera, et cetera. And I think it was Ashlyn who was like, well, it would be kind of funny if Cousteau's did a weed brand and called it Seaweed. And we all kind of laughed about it. And then I'll let Ashlyn finish the story because it's really was her influence that challenged. And as always, the best that challenged me to, in the best ways to, and us to do things like this. So.
I like that. Or also he makes sure that he can blame me.
Plausible deniability, Brett.
Exactly.
But I think for us, when we thought of the name and we laughed about it, and it was one of those ideas that just kept coming back up. And we would think about it a couple days later and say, well, could we really start a cannabis line? And what would that look like? And, for us, like Phillippe said, the intentionality for us to do any type of brand has been in the back of our minds, since he and I first started dating. And we just never could figure out the right fit because we looked at fashion, but fashion, the number 3 polluter in the world. So we didn't want to do that. We looked at beds and sheets and things like it, but nothing ever felt right. Phillippe loves to cook. We thought about doing food, but just nothing felt right and nothing felt authentic to us. And so we really started thinking about this. And A, the name is freaking amazing. And B, when we realized that we could introduce a whole group of people, a new demographic that we've never hit with any of our television shows or books or speeches, if we could hit a new group of people and talk to them about the ocean and the importance of the ocean and benefit the ocean and actually restore it with these products, we figured that's the win-win. So if we could create a product that wasn't just creating more stuff, something that actually worked, that helped people and that helped the planet and really grew the blue economy, then it was a win for us. And we found ourselves here with Seaweed Naturals.
Yeah. And, it's really once Jill started to explain the economics too and the opportunity. It's not very often that you see a consumer products industry that is so unsophisticated, frankly, and so kind of nascent, and yet already worth billions of dollars. We really were like, wow, there's a huge opportunity here because these active ingredients, seaweed and omega-3s and kelp, etc., these are already well established in the cosmetic space. Mm-hmm. People are likely using them already on their countertops. And yet there's this whole burgeoning category of wellness in cannabis that, frankly, and there's some great brands out there, but they're pretty unsophisticated. Like if you look at them, they're basically just THC cream. And we felt like, oh my goodness, no one has taken that step of saying, well, why don't we take other clinically proven active ingredients that also affect topically redness and pain and inflammation, all these issues, or when ingested are a superfood or help, boost your brain, like omega-3s doing all these things that we know and are established, and combine them with the incredible efficacy of cannabis and THC products. No one's done this. Like, how has no one done this? Oh my goodness.
That's that innovator brain that comes with your family.
Yes, exactly. So we were like, all right, and I started thinking about it. And Ashlyn, really, we talked about it a lot. And she said, your grandfather at his core was about innovation. Your father was about innovation and problem solving. And we have a lot of problems in the world. And if we can tap into and create a products in this multi-billion-dollar baby industry that can help support ocean regeneration and people's health, like why wouldn't we want to do that?
Lastly, I wanted to know why a member of the famous political Roosevelt family had moved into legal marijuana. Jacques Roosevelt, grandson of FDR, is now the CEO of Lucida Club, a cannabis concierge platform that guides canna-curious consumers through the process of picking the right marijuana products for them. So I asked Jacques what his experience had been with cannabis before and after legalization, and why he wanted to enter the legal industry.
So what was your understanding of cannabis as you were growing up?
Actually, it's funny because I grew up in the UK and in Europe, like cannabis, weed was not something that we really tried that much. I mean, the term, as you well know, I remember skunk was our only option, and really weed was, it was not something you smoked on a regular basis at all. But we all had hash.
Yeah, solid, right?
Yeah, exactly. Little balls of hash. And that was a very different high. It was when I would come back and visit my friends in the States that we'd smoke weed. And yeah, I didn't really have a huge amount of exposure growing up. Like it wasn't until I came back here to the States that weed became something. And when I was traveling around in Europe a little bit, you could get weed a lot more in Europe than you could in England. And what would make it, from a weed standpoint, what would make it across the channel and make it actually over to the UK, it was never any good. It was really not good stuff. But yeah, I remember being in Amsterdam, and that was kind of my exposure. And then when I moved back over here, my exposure to weed was very different to what it is today. It was, you'd go and find this, and really it was buying from the stoner crew in college. And it was, you would be like, okay, this is $20 an eighth, this is $40 an eighth, this is $80 an eighth, or whatever it was, right? Whatever the pricing was. And it was basically, you didn't know if it was indica, you didn't know if it was sativa, you didn't know what strain it was. The idea of hybrid, I'd never heard of that until a couple of years ago. And even really the fact that there was an indica or sativa, that was not something that I was even aware of, and literally until actually trying to research for because of the problems I had trying to buy for the first time after legalization here in Massachusetts. And that was kind of an eye-opener to me. And so where the industry is today is fundamentally different to what it was 20 years ago when I was in college, or even back in Europe. And even thinking about going to the Bulldog Cafe in Leidsplan in Amsterdam, and going to the first coffee shop I'd ever been to. And I was there actually with some friends when the Cannabis Cup was going on. And that was probably my first exposure to the concept of strains and the idea that people were growing, multiple strains. I mean, when I was younger, it was, the idea of I don't know. I knew of Inca Gold or whatever it was called. It was not there were not multiple strains out there. And so, yeah, I think 20 years ago, being in Amsterdam and talking to some people, we actually met in the Bulldog Cafe. I remember we met this guy that was a judge at the Cannabis Cup, and understanding kind of what he was doing and what they were doing was kind of my first exposure in those days. And then leaving